Hi guys, thank you for coming. This is going to be our first HIPS lecture for this semester, so we're really excited. We have some fun stuff lined up. If anyone would like to see dates, meet me after, and I will get you caught up on what we've got going on. Today, we're going to be having Dr. Mark Dries talk to us today about Venezuela. He is the graduate coordinator here at Southeastern. A lot of you have probably taken him, or at least have seen him around. So, put your hands together. Thank you, Dr. Dries.
Thank you. Just to be clear, the fun stuff starts next meeting. This will not be the fun stuff. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. It's one of the few talks that I've given. Usually I'm talking about the 16th century, so this is one of the few talks I've been given where I agreed to do it, and then more things happened that I had to add afterwards. So that's been a fun experience. But what I'd like to talk about today is a little bit about what's going on between the United States and Venezuela with a little bit of context, because that's what historians do, and then to talk at least a little bit about why we're kind of in this position at the moment. And I'll get to my references here as we go. But to start with, I wanted to go into some of the kind of long context. If you think about the 1980s as long, which I'm increasingly starting to think that I have to, and that is to think about what kind of position Venezuela was in when we get up to the mid-90s and when we talk about the rise of Hugo Chavez, who's kind of a pivotal figure in the relationship between the United States and Venezuela. And so if we think about 1980, it was in a lot of ways kind of a pivotal year, if you think about Latin American economies in general and Venezuela in particular. For a while after World War II, many Latin American nations had pivoted towards state intervention in the economy. So what does that mean? State-owned and protected industries, protectionist policies that helped industries get off the ground in places like Brazil and Argentina and Venezuela. Now for Venezuela, that meant mostly oil. But by the time we get to the 1980s, a lot of those policies would have to change because the economic conditions in the world changed. This was the end of what a lot of scholars have described as the Latin American economic miracle. We get to 1980 and specifically thinking of Venezuela, the price of oil drops out, and this hurts nations like Venezuela that produce oil. But it also, paradoxically, doesn't help any of the nations that rely on importing oil because the price stayed low and it didn't necessarily help them. So coming out of the inflationary period of the 1970s, we hit the drop in oil prices by the time we get to the 1980s. And this leads to a recession and a dip in GDPs in Europe and the United States, which in one of the rare instances of true trickle-down economics, caused all kinds of problems in places like Latin America. So scholars of Latin America think about this as the lost decade. This was a decade in which there was an average about 1.5% GDP growth across Latin America, which is not enough to keep up with population growth, which means your economies are getting worse. And the other problem with this is that the response in the United States, led by Ronald Reagan, was a series of policies that would dampen global trade, would decrease Latin American access to things like credit, would increase unemployment in the area, and would decrease international investment in Latin America. So it was kind of a perfect storm of problems for Latin American economies, Venezuela included, leading to a surge in poverty levels in Latin America by about 40%, according to the UN. So this was a dire moment. That's why we think about this as a watershed. And so what happens? How does Latin America respond, and how does that shape Venezuela? Well, after 1980, we have a shift away from those economic policies that I described. A move away in most Latin American countries from the idea that the state should be involved in the economy, should control key industries, should favor local workers and protect local industries, largely because a lot of people turned on those policies when their economies started to go sour after 1980. Now, this was interesting because in a lot of Latin American nations, especially in the Southern Cone, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil as well, you see these kinds of conditions leading to economic problems and an increase in democratization. People rose up against military governments and overthrew them, taking more control of the governments that they lived under. However, that's somewhat paradoxical because usually we think of popular participation in favor of social programs, and these popular uprisings had the opposite effect. After 1980, we see a decrease in basically any kind of government support for social welfare in these areas. And we see a rise of what we can think of as neoliberalism. Now, this was basically an advocacy of free markets and emphasis on private property, and a decrease or elimination of state intervention in the economy at all. So again, the emphasis here is individualism, private property ownership, as opposed to national control of the economy in favor of what they might think of as collective welfare. Now, this was a kind of a economic orthodoxy at the time. It was prevalent in many parts of the world, and it was also sort of exported to Latin America. One of the classic examples are the famous Chicago Boys, who were a group of economists that went from the University of Chicago, specifically to Chile, and broke in all kinds of neoliberal economic policies there. So this was something that was extremely influential. Another one of the big names to know, if we think about this shift, was the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. As worldwide economic conditions led to a decreased access to credit in Latin America, the IMF started giving out loans or renegotiating loans based on Latin American countries and governments accepting austerity policies, basically cuts in government spending, usually on social welfare, and deregulation of their economies. So the general tendencies that I'm trying to describe here are a shift away from government intervention towards privatization, more deregulation of economies, so a decrease in trade barriers. Labor unions would no longer have the state as their supporter, their benefactor, or their intermediary, and we have a shift towards free markets in general. Now, this is the broad picture in Latin America. So what does it look like when we think about Venezuela? Now, I described things as pretty bad after 1980, but in terms of Venezuela, they were, of Latin American nations, probably one of the ones that was best equipped to deal with these kinds of adverse conditions. Venezuela was one of 4 nations in Latin America that was certified as an upper to middle income economy by the time we get to 1980. So they were doing very, very well, largely on the back of oil production controlled, or at least partially controlled, by the state. But after 1980, they were, of course, very much influenced by the fact that the price of oil dropped out. And so by the time we go through the 1980s, Latin America and Venezuela in particular were dealing with a series of currency and debt crises. Their currency was worth less and less. Their national debt was harder and harder for them to repay. And when we get to the 1990s, we have an increase in inflation that pretty much wiped out any savings any Venezuelan people had. So economic growth continued to be dependent on oil. Per capita growth stagnated. Unemployment surged in Venezuela by the time we get to the early 90s. And government deficits increased despite the fact that the government was no longer providing the services that a lot of Venezuelans needed. By 1999, for example, real wages were 70% lower than they'd been in 1979. We had 2/3 of the population in poverty. And probably one of the more interesting ways of thinking about this is that if you had at least 12 years of education in Venezuela in 1989 or in 1979, you had maybe a 2% chance of ending up below the poverty line there. By the time you get to 1999, that was roughly a 18.5% chance. So even education, which is considered to be one of the remedies for these kinds of dire economic conditions, even education didn't guarantee people a stable living. So why not do something about it? Well, that was actually exactly the thinking. And Venezuelan governments did almost everything they could possibly do about as quickly as they could possibly do it. And they started what some scholars have described as kind of an axe and relax cycle. The axe being cutting spending by the government, and the relaxing being pulling back from those attempted reforms when there's a popular outcry. So to give you an idea, we had the stabilization period in which they used the government to cut spending to try and stabilize the economy from 85 to 88. There was shock therapy from 89 to 92. There was gradualism, a slow implementation of government cuts on spending from 96 to 98. There were price controls put in place to try and stabilize the situation from 94 to 96. Trade liberalization, extreme form of trade liberalization, from 1990 to 93. And then there were subsidies introduced at the same time in 1990 to 1992. So the outcome of these things was pretty much no benefit to the Venezuelan economy because of the broader issues, and more concretely, a loss of faith by a lot of Venezuelan people in what their government could do. A lot of people basically started to feel like their institutions could not serve them. Which brings us to Hugo Chavez. Colonel Hugo Chavez. Seen here in one of the rare pictures where he wasn't wearing a military uniform, but I just love the fact that he had his letterhead there in his appearance. Hugo Chavez came from probably, I can describe it as kind of a nondescript background. He was from a small town. He enlisted in the military at a young age. Notice he enlisted, so he didn't start as an officer. That's not really the way you want to go, but he distinguished himself pretty well. He became a paratrooper, which was kind of an elite group in the Venezuelan military. He rose through the ranks. He was known as someone who was smart. He has had an excellent memory, but he wasn't formally educated. So members of the upper class in Venezuela would consistently speak poorly of him, to put it lightly. Even after he was president, there were elements of Venezuelan society that would make fun of him and call him a monkey, and he would playfully respond oftentimes to the satisfaction of his followers that he was part Indio and part Mono. So he was part monkey and part Indian, and they had it wrong all along. But Chavez became this charismatic member of the military, and he was able to draw on that dissatisfaction that a lot of Venezuelan people felt about their government, its inability to respond to the crisis they were living in. And he was able to channel this in the direction of change. In 1992, he attempted to lead a coup, but he failed. And he ended up spending 2 years in jail before his release. Those 2 years were not idle time. A lot of people knew who he was. It got him publicity. So by the mid-90s, he had a lot of supporters, and there were a lot of people that were even angrier than they had been in 1992. Both the two major political parties in Venezuela, without getting too far into it, didn't have a lot of support from common people. They'd alternated in power since 1958, and it made people feel like nothing changed either way. There was also clearly demonstrated acts of corruption by both sides. So people were desperate for anything else. And Chavez was really good at moderating his message about what he wanted to do in ways that it resonated with people who might not have considered themselves political. He called it his Bolivarian revolution, harkening back to the Venezuelan hero Simón Bolívar of the independence period. And that has I tried to think of like an American figure that had the kind of hold on people that Bolívar had in the 90s in Venezuela. And I couldn't really think of one because universally he was someone that people looked up to, people admired. So this was a clever move by Chavez. And he basically also recreated the kind of political style that he used in Venezuela. It had been upper class, polished types in suits. He came from a lower class background, and he used a more confrontational style, to put it lightly. He was brash. He was very willing to use the media in ways that connected with common people. He was on TV and radio. He almost monopolized the media when he was building himself up in his career. And he seemed to be everywhere all at once. He was not someone who lacked from exposure. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it. He was folksy and not polished, but he frequently was able to mock his opponents and put them in bad positions. And he found a ready audience, which he exploited after becoming president in 1997 by creating one of his most famous outlets, Presidente, which was a weekly show that he would have at about 11 o'clock on Sundays. It was supposed to be the time when he could speak to the working people. And it was famous for its horrible production values. It was compared by a New York Times reporter to like a bad knockoff of The Daily Show, because he sits behind a desk and rails and does all of this stuff. But it was effective. People watched it, in part because they had to sometimes. He would broadcast this on private stations and on state-owned television, so you couldn't watch anything else. But Chavez would use these kinds of things to kind of push himself out there, to get his message out there about what he was supposedly doing for the people. He even had a catchphrase. He would show up at large factories or prominent buildings or places that people might recognize him on the street. He loved to interact with people in real time, which is risky, but he managed to pull it off most of the time. He'd show up at places, large buildings that were empty, and he would say, "Expropriated," and then there would be a round of applause, and it would look like he was taking things back for the common people. So he became president in 1997, and people wanted him to create change, but he became president with support from some change-minded middle-class people and some people who just lost all faith in the system. The big problem was that he believed in order to do anything that would change the conditions in Venezuela, he would have to deal with the state-owned oil company. And that is Petroleros de Venezuela. SA is just kind of like incorporated in Spanish, Sociedad Anónima. So that was the state-owned oil company. And he realized he wanted to take complete control of it, but he knew that would challenge some entrenched interests, whether it was the working class unions that worked there or the upper classes that made up management. So he tried to do that in 2002, and workers immediately went on strike. He pulled back from that couple of weeks later, in April of that year, after all this turmoil, the military attempted to seize power from him. And at that point, his followers took to the streets and pushed to have him put back in power. When he came back in power, there was a general strike by his opponents that lasted from December of 2002 to February of 2003. And yet somehow he kept himself in power. There were enough people there and enough support of the military for him to stay in power. And while everything is falling down around him, he took advantage of the situation. He fired 17,000 workers from the state-owned petroleum company, and he basically guaranteed himself control of it in order to finance his revolution. And that's what he tried to do. He tried to use the oil profits that the state-owned company was producing, although there were also private companies operating, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and others. He tried to use the profits from the state-owned company in order to finance social programs that would make it seem like he was living up to his promises to the common people. Now, if you're aware of these kinds of projects, at least in Latin America, that usually doesn't work. And the reason for that is that in order to keep in a capital-intensive industry like oil production running, you need to invest heavily to maintain your production. And if all your money is going to social programs, that's really, really hard to do. So profits started to drop from oil, and yet he still couldn't reinvest because he had to maintain these social programs. And all of this was a back and forth that kind of characterized his period in power from 1997 until 2013. Now that makes it sound like it was precarious, and to believe it or not, it was. But he did seem to eke out consistent electoral victories. He was elected in 1997. In 2008, his supporters in government were able to pass a new constitution. He was reelected in 2006. He was reelected again in 2012, just barely. And then he eventually ends up dying of cancer after his election in 2013. All of which brings us to his protege, Nicolas Maduro. And Maduro had been his kind of lieutenant from roughly 2008 on, I believe. And he was the man who was supposed to step up and take charge by the time we get to the death of Chavez in 2013. And he did that in 2013 and narrowly won election, but he stepped into a terrible situation economically. The 2008 financial crash had led to the exit of several foreign companies from oil production in Venezuela. And it also had led to Chavez making a significant policy change in which required foreign companies to have at least 60% of their production controlled by the Venezuelan state, all of which made oil production in Venezuela unpopular. And so by the time Maduro came into power, it was 2013. By the time we get to 2014, we have some concrete statistics that show us that there really hadn't been much of a recovery in Venezuela. Corruption continued to be a problem. Protests were rampant, in part because as popular as Chavez had been, at least with some segments of the population, it's hard to pass that popularity on. When you're a populist like Chavez, you can't just make people like the person that you put on the presidential throne after you. So Venezuela is facing all kinds of problems. Protests are happening in the streets. Maduro cracks down on them with the police and with military forces, which is incredibly unpopular. By 2016, the IMF had declared that Venezuela had the world's worst economy. It was shrinking by 10% a year. And so you had really basic things becoming incredibly difficult to get in Venezuela. Food. I remember someone told me that Tylenol was so hard to get that people were smuggling it in and selling it for, huge amounts of money if they could get the money, but the money, of course, was also losing value. So how does all of this fit with the United States? Well, Chavez had always been, as I tried to describe, really confrontational in all of his rhetoric. He was very happy, as we can see here, to be friends with anyone who was not friends with the United States. He basically considered himself a surrogate son of Fidel Castro. He was friendly with Evo Morales and other left-leaning politicians of Latin America in the period of the Pink Tide in the early 2000s. He thought of himself as this renegade, right? And he was very happy to, as he would probably describe it, although maybe not in these words, try and speak truth to power when that power was the United States. He called President George W. Bush during the period of the War on Terror Mr. Danger, after a popular character in a Venezuelan novel. And he frequently criticized him for things that the rest of the international community tended to get behind. The War on Terror in Afghanistan, for example, he was openly critical of. He also visited Iraq at the period in time when the United States was going in the direction of invading Iraq after 2001. And yet, for all of his talk, the United States and Venezuela maintained diplomatic relations, and the U.S. was the primary customer for Venezuelan oil. So Chavez talked a big game, but he also knew who buttered his bread. Now, the problem is, things start coming to a head just as Chavez exits the scene, and this is obviously trouble for Maduro. By the time we get to 2014 and 2015, the United States starts to take a more aggressive stance on its own. The U.S. imposes economic sanctions due to allegations of human rights violations by Maduro's regime in their crackdown on protesters. So this, of course, creates much worse economic conditions in Venezuela. Shortages of things like food and, again, medicine in particular became incredibly acute. Inflation, which was already bad, starts to skyrocket. And this is the period in which we see huge numbers of immigrants fleeing Venezuela, which would strain international relations as well. Between 2017 and 2019, the U.S. would continue to sanction Venezuela, targeting not only their financial system, but also oil production. And so they blocked the purchase of Venezuelan debt, and they started to increasingly put pressure on those who imported Venezuelan oil. By this point, if it hadn't really already happened, Venezuelan economy almost completely collapses. In 2019, inflation peaked at 345%. So basically, your money was so worthless by the time you walked somewhere to buy something with it that the price was already higher than you thought it would be when you walked there. Right? In April of 2025, inflation was still at 172%. So you're basically devolving into a barter economy at that point. And in 2018, in the midst of this period of economic collapse, Maduro runs for re-election. And this is the first of two highly questionable elections in which Maduro claims to have won, but international observers and others are highly skeptical of that claim. Basically, Maduro used all the tricks he possibly could to secure his entrance back into office. He barred key opposition candidates from running, which prompted a boycott of the election, which meant that only those who supported Maduro went out and voted. And then he promptly showed everyone the voting tallies and said that that meant he'd won. Now, Juan Guaido, his opponent, proclaimed himself the interim president of Venezuela. He was recognized by the United States and dozens of other allies, despite the fact that he left Venezuela. And in response to Maduro staying in office, the United States increased sanctions on oil as well as gold, as well as mining and banking sectors in Venezuela. So the condition in Venezuela continues to get worse. In 2020, the Justice Department indicted Maduro in narco-terrorism and in a cocaine trafficking conspiracy, claiming that he had helped to lead a violent drug cartel. So we start to see new allegations adding on. And all of this leads up to the period in which things really start getting dicey with the United States and Venezuela. In 2024, Maduro again won a highly disputed election. And this one, there are actually some tallies from certain places that show his opponent well ahead. And then all of a sudden, Maduro just claims that he won. Now, this drew a lot of criticism from the United States, including from then Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who said there was, quote, overwhelming evidence that Maduro's opponent had won. And in January of 2024, before leaving office, President Biden and his administration recognized Gonzalez, the opponent of Maduro, who had fled Venezuela and claimed to be legitimate leader. Now, all of this leads us to the current situation. In July of 2025, President Trump and his administration added the Cartel de los Soles, which basically means the cartel of the suns, and characterized them as a, quote, Venezuelan-based criminal group. Now, that's pretty broad. So what do we mean by Venezuelan-based criminal groups? Basically, they were added to the list of global terrorist organizations, and they named Maduro as their leader. Now, this met with some skepticism from journalists and some Latin American scholars who said, corrupt? Absolutely. A group of corrupt officials? Sure. International drug cartel? Harder to prove. And yet, President Trump, that same month, would sign a secret order directing the military to use force against Latin American drug cartels identified as terrorist organizations. So some people have pointed to this as those two events as connected, right? Label a government entity or a group that's affiliated with government corruption a terrorist entity, and then authorize the military to use force. In August the Pentagon began dispatching warships, fighter jets, and other military assets to the Caribbean. On August 7th, Attorney General Pam Bondi offered a $50 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Maduro. On September 2nd, the president ordered the first strikes on Venezuelan boats. The claim was that the boats carried terrorists, members of the Tren de Aragua criminal organization, and that it was attacked in international waters by the U.S. military. 11 were killed, and Venezuelan President Maduro issues a statement calling it a crime and saying if the U.S. believed that those on board were trafficking drugs, then they should have captured them, which is an interesting question. On October 2nd, President Trump instructed Richard Grenell, then the special presidential envoy to Venezuela, to stop diplomatic outreach. There had been negotiations going on between Maduro and his regime and Richard Grenell to secure access by American companies to Venezuelan oil. By November 12th, we've had the 20th strike on boats in the Caribbean with 80 total deaths. By December 2nd, the Secretary of War or Defense, Hegza, had cited the fog of war to justify a lack of clarity based on a second strike on an already targeted boat that killed what appeared to be 2 survivors. And by December 31st, we've had 35 strikes on leading to at least 115 fatalities in the Caribbean as well as in the Pacific. Which brings us to January 2nd, 2026, in which President Trump announces on social media the capture of Mr. Maduro and his wife in strikes on Caracas and other parts of Venezuela. There were reportedly, at least according to Venezuelan sources, at least 80 killed in these strikes. And the president celebrated the capture of Maduro, who again was criticized of drug trafficking, brought to Manhattan, where he is now facing charges. On January 5th, Maduro and his wife pled not guilty. According to my sister who lives in Brooklyn, they're in the same jail that has Diddy and Ghislaine Maxwell. So maybe the most notorious piece of urban real estate in the United States. When we get to January 4th, when asked what the future of Venezuela would look like, President Trump says that the United States would, quote, run Venezuela, though Maduro officials were still largely left in place. And on January 5th, Maduro and his wife, as I mentioned, pled not guilty to drug trafficking. So where do we go from here? The biggest clue that we have comes from the president himself, who said on January 9th that U.S. oil companies will spend at least $100 billion to rebuild Venezuela's energy sector. He replied that the United States would provide protection so, quote, they get their money back and make a very nice return. The president also stated that the U.S. would decide which companies would participate and cut a deal with those companies. The claim that followed that to justify these actions were that this would bring lower energy prices and that Venezuela will purchase only American goods, leading to a beneficial economic relationship for both of these nations. Now, the problem with that is that according to several economists I was able to find, an estimated investment to reinvigorate the Venezuelan oil production would require at least $180 billion. And from what we've seen, Chevron has always been on the ground. They never left Venezuela, but ExxonMobil and others did leave, if not before, in the 2008 economic downturn. So far, oil companies have seemed very reluctant to get involved because it's a huge investment they're expected to pay for, and that security the United States has promised to provide could prove problematic, particularly given that most of the people who are in power in Venezuela are members of Maduro's regime. So I think one of the most kind of pithy write-ups of the whole situation was in last month's New York Review of Books, in which the author, Alma Guillermo Prieto, who's a scholar, argues that this is another one of those versions of history sadly repeating itself. In this case, I think she mentions out of spite. What we see here is the United States taking control of an asset. Venezuela does have the world's largest proven crude oil reserves, with the idea that this will prove profitable, but the plan doesn't seem to be more than a few weeks ahead. So how exactly this will pan out for the United States after President Trump leaves office is an open question, and there doesn't seem to be a clear path forward. So we'll have to hear about this more. Any questions on that? I wish I had more of a good answer to the why, but I feel like it's right there in front of us, and yet the roadmap forward is definitely not a clear one.
Yeah, that's what you kind of answered part of my question. But that was kind of like what it was pertaining to as far as like in America trying to just acquire Venezuela as an asset. You know, the charges, are those just kind of like made up charges. I mean, when you think about it, technically charges like that kind of, get applied to minority groups kind of, circumstantially. So I was thinking along those points, it might just be like, we're charging them in drug trafficking or whatever, and then just to acquire Venezuela, but it's, null and void charges, Yes, no, maybe so?
I mean, that's a good question. Do you mean specifically the charges against Maduro, that he's involved in drug trafficking? Do I think he's involved in like high-level corruption? Absolutely. Do I think he would have been involved to the degree that he would have been, materially making plans for the international drug trafficking? I don't think so. I don't think he would have needed to. I think the profit and corruption he was generating in his government, and Chavez was too, was sufficient for them to avoid that kind of risk. Now, if you were asking about the accusations of drug trafficking by small boats in the Caribbean and in the Pacific, one of the kind of glaring problems with that is that there just hasn't been any proof. And the idea of destroying craft and killing individuals, there's been a number of attempts to kind of dance around it legally by saying that there's a state of war between drug cartels and the United States government, which becomes problematic because, again, that assumes that any individuals in those craft are in drug cartels. Basically, there's kind of a lack of legal proof there, which I think will continue to be something that a lot of people will follow up on.
This is a much broader question. But what do you think about the concept of narco-terrorism? It assumes that, terrorists are dealing drugs, which undoubtedly they are in some instances. What happens when they become the government, as in the case of the Taliban, who were certainly dealing heroin to the West, or, and openly doing so? Is it still terrorism, or is it narco-state terrorism? It's a nice word to use if you want to vilify somebody, but I'm not sure anybody really knows what it means.
Well, I'm certainly not going to step into that void and say I know what it means, but I think.
I was hoping you knew.
Well, I think the way you set up the question was outstanding, though, because it reminds me of a lot of things that you read about Venezuela talk about it as a petrostate. Like it rises and falls based on oil, and that very profitable single industry controlled by the state to varying degrees spins off all kinds of corruption. And so it produces a series of characteristics that political scientists would talk about, a lack of faith in institutions, cronyism at the highest levels, but trickling all the way down to a kind of a populist investment by the lower classes in the people at the top. I think if you set up a state based on the transport of drugs, then I think it would look a lot like a petro state. You have this very, very profitable, substance commodity that you can transport and traffic, and if the state controls it, that sort of generates all the profit. So I think I think you could think about it that same way.
Well, it seems to me, one of the suggestions has been that a lot of those boats were actually destined for Africa rather than to the United States, which in some respects is closer. That would, in a sense, make more sense in terms of the relative corruption on both sides of the deal there. And I know a lot of the talk about what they were supposedly bringing in was fentanyl, which doesn't come that way across the border. And hard to compete with Colombia for cocaine or for anything that's bad for you.
Well, and the accusation of fentanyl in particular contradicted earlier statements by the CIA that the majority of fentanyl came from other routes, and that the transport of drugs on boats from Venezuela specifically was pretty much negligible when you think about the known points of entry. So again, kind of undercuts the idea that there's a state of war between specifically these groups.
This is gonna be a bit of a silly question, but would you say the economic state of Venezuela from like the 80s to arguably now would be like akin to the Great Depression or maybe worse?
I mean, comparisons are always tough, but in terms of like the lived experience of it, yeah, I would say a lot of people living in Caracas are experiencing things as bad as the worst moments of the Great Depression. Yeah, I mean, I would say, we'd have to look at the Great Depression to find economic circumstances that were as bad. The one thing that I would say is different is the Great Depression was so worldwide, and there are people here who can speak better to that than I can. But a lot of Venezuelans, I mean, one of the things interesting about it is 10 years ago, I think there were 720,000, according to one article I read, 720,000 Venezuelans living abroad. But in the last 10 years, now there's supposed to be at least 7.2 million. And about 2.9 million of those live in Colombia. My own kind of anecdotal, for what that's worth, evidence of this is that, the last couple of times I've been to Lima, there's people driving cabs that are Venezuelan. And I was like, oh, really? Like, so, what did you do there? And I mean, they're doctors. A lot of them are not necessarily the poorest of the poor who might make their way to Colombia or Guyana. A lot of them are people in that middle class group that felt like what Chavez was doing wasn't helping them and they got out. So one of the reasons why Maduro and Chavez were able to stay in power is there was this flight of the professional classes from Venezuela. And those are the people that were able to make it further away. But a lot of the people who are stuck there are absolutely living in the kind of conditions that would have been characterized by the worst of the Great Depression.
What's the state of the Venezuelan military in all of this? So were they complicit in the capture of Maduro, or where do they stand now in terms of independent leadership or aligning with new leadership that's been put in place? I mean, they have been a really active part under Chavez. What is the status right now?
That is a fantastic question. I haven't seen much. Some of the really kind of, immediate reaction, knee-jerk kind of stuff was just kind of an embarrassment. It was almost like this black eye that they wanted to hide for a little while. But since the period when Chavez had his kind of run-in with them very early on, they've been pretty associated with the regime, and by associating with the regime, they've, been funded. And it's been, another one of those sources of another place to put loyal people. But beyond that, in terms of what their relationship is to the current regime in Venezuela, which has talked much more in a much more conciliatory manner to the United States, I haven't seen much. I don't think it's clear, and
it seems like a hole in the reporting.
Mhm.
You try to search foreign affairs and see what they can come up with in terms of information about this. I haven't found anything.
Well, if you haven't found any and I haven't found any, then I think you're right, and I think that's really interesting that there's this hole in reporting.
That's a big chunk of population and asset base, power base, that seems to have just evaporated from the conversation. Obviously, they're still there.
I'm not too sure how to phrase this because I'm not too familiar with either of these conflicts, but I was curious if you see any parallels between what's currently happening with Venezuela and what happened with Panama with Operation Just Cause, because both, I forget his name, the dictator of Panama at the time, he was also tried for drug trafficking, I believe.
Mhm.
I'm just curious if you see any parallels with how that went about, and if we might be just sort of reliving a similar thing.
Good question. So I think the connection to drug trafficking was much more concrete in that instance, which made the justification a little more straightforward. I think one of the other things about it is that it was the build up to that kind of cross political lines in the United States in the way that this run up to escalation with Venezuela, in the last year or so didn't necessarily. It was under the Biden administration that there were sanctions that were placed on. So we see an escalation of tensions that contributed to the deterioration of things in Venezuela, but it didn't look like the previous presidential administration. It didn't look like there was any road that would have led them to this level of escalation. So I would say that's a little different because with Noriega, there was kind of clear bipartisan opposition to what he was doing and more evidence that he was doing, he was involved in drug-related activities. The other thing I think is a really clear difference is there wasn't really any claim by the United States they would stay there. And there also wasn't any other claim beyond the fact that they were countering a dictator who was involved in the transport of drugs. Very quickly, the president of the United States said, we're gonna stay in Venezuela. We're gonna run it for the foreseeable future. We're gonna control the oil, and there have been transfers of several million barrels of oil since the actions took place with Maduro. So again, that seems to be one of the key differences: the continued involvement of the United States in a way where they're basically controlling export by seizing tankers and others, and they're using that as a means of leveraging Venezuela to control that relationship in a way that I didn't really see with Panama.
So whenever Chavez fired 17,000 workers, were those all like oil, like plant workers?
Yeah, I mean, up and down. So it was a state-run industry, and the classic criticism of state-run industries, going back to that post-World War II period where, Latin American companies were getting involved in these kind of things, is that they ended up getting bloated. They'd have a bloated bureaucracy. They'd hire 3 people to do the job of 2 people. Unions could rely on the government to defend them, to stand up for them. Like firing anyone involved in these state-run industries was hard. So some of them were people that, worked on the ground level, plant-type workers. A lot of them were bureaucracy. A lot of them were, administrative people that, had various levels. But it seemed to have hurt, at least to the extent that we see that rapid drop off in production, it seemed to have hurt every level of the industry. They lost expertise. They lost people who were on the ground. Maybe they had 3 people doing the job of 2, but they lost the 2 that were doing the job. So it seems like it was kind of across the board, but politically targeted. And then, Chavistas were put right back in place.
So it was like intentionally they were trying to just like cut funding so they could get maximum profits, but in doing so they kind of subverted the whole point by making the oil less productive, I guess.
Pretty much. But it's one of those Faustian bargains you make, right? You want to take control of the industry so you can use its profits to do something else. But I mean, it's kind of a known thing that unless you're reinvesting in production, those profits are going to decrease over time. So, yeah, I mean, that happened in a variety of other nations that produced oil and attempted similar things. It happened in the 2000s with natural gas in Bolivia and other places. So, yeah.
Okay. I guess I have maybe a follow-up question, and this might be off. But like, is like the civil life right now, people still a little bit in an unrest, for the most part, with the civilians of Venezuela?
Yeah.
Would you say like maybe the military's having to deal with internal issues quite a bit as well as the external issues?
I mean, under Maduro, the military took on kind of a security function. In terms of what they've been doing since Maduro was removed, it seems, and again, there's kind of this hole in reporting, but I would guess, because again, most of Maduro's officials were left in place. So it's not like we didn't see regime change so much as we saw, a head cut off a snake and 2 or 3 more spring up. So I think the military is kind of retrenching its position. I think people in Venezuela, I mean, there were popular, expressions of like happiness, not just in Venezuela, but in other places in Venezuela that were permitted, but also, around the world, which were legitimate. I mean, people were happy to see him out of office. But I don't think anyone knew exactly what would happen next. And from what I've read, it didn't seem like a lot of people were super optimistic. It seemed like their happiness in that moment was kind of retroactive, like he did all these horrible things and now he's gone. It didn't seem like people had yet turned the page, maybe out of a reluctance to do it, because it doesn't seem like there's a clear path forward in terms of what the military and what the political system is going to look like.
You never know when you're trading Patrice Lumumba for Mobutu Sese Seko.
Do you know what's going to happen in the Defense Council? Have you heard who is defending them?
I have not.
I haven't either.
I've gotten very few details about how is that going to work. Yeah, it'll be interesting.
Maybe it's just a giant diversion.
We'll have to see.
Look over here and.
Well, I mean,
get away with everything else.
people have said that this was a diversion, that what was going on in Venezuela was a diversion from something else, and then Greenland was the next diversion. It seems like we're going from what could be diversion to diversion, but the overarching plan is not entirely clear. In Venezuela, again, I'm trying to hedge my bets on this, but it seems like oil makes sense, and that connection makes the most sense as the motive. But there could always be a bigger international picture.
Was that Fidel Castro and Maduro or Chavez?
That's Chavez. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Chavez loved being in pictures with Castro. Yeah, he kind of openly looked up to him.
When was that picture?
That one I don't remember, but it would have had to have been probably in the late 90s.
Okay.
Because Castro looks pretty And they kind of have yeah, he looks pretty good. He looks pretty good for him. They have similar like speaking styles. Castro would give like 3-4 hour speeches, and Chavez is the same way. He'll just like, if he has prepared remarks, they're like a couple of note cards, and he'll set them aside, and he would just go. So yeah, yeah, I'm sure Castro or Chavez had a picture of that on his desk.
Question about when Chavez came to power. Did he have the backing of business, like such as it stood at that time? Was there kind of an industrial, petrochemical elite that chose to support him because they believed there would be benefits on the outside of that, or was it purely a popular movement?
I don't know if I'd call it popular in the sense that it came from the like grassroots. He had strong, at least in the earliest phase, he had strong middle class support. Like that professional class that would flee after he kind of started really upsetting the apple cart. There were a lot of people that wanted him in '97 that were in that kind of urban middle class that was clinging to that status after everything in the 1980s. In terms of the oil industry, from what I've been able to see, it felt like it was outside of these events in an interesting way. There were foreign companies that were still involved, Chevron most notably from the United States, but others, and they were operating and generating profit. And so they kind of existed outside of that. Those who worked for them felt shielded from that. Even the nationalized oil company felt kind of insulated from what was going on, which is why I think when he tried to take control of it in 2002, it generated such a massive pushback, even 5 years after he entered into power. And that was, again, middle-class people, unions that worked for the state-owned oil company, and people who were like, oh my gosh, he's really doing some of the things that he said he would do. But yeah, beyond that, that's a great question. I don't have anything I've read to refer to, so I'd be speculating if I said much more.
You've shown 2 pictures of him in cities, and in both he's wearing a red shirt. Is that sort of an unofficial uniform for him?
Unofficially, and officially, he liked to be in uniform. He always used to wear his beret, and I can't believe I found pictures without berets for him. He was a colonel, which was not a particularly high rank, but he kept that rank. So he never, promoted himself or anything else. But yeah, he usually showed in military uniform.
Neither did Gaddafi.
That's a good point. That's a good point. And I think that was obviously very deliberate. He wanted to, he didn't want to be associated with those upper classes that started increasingly to ridicule him. There was always kind of a, he was never quite one of the upper classes, and he sort of, leaned into that. And he did cultivate a very loyal base at the bottom. He
lasted longer than General Galtieri, didn't he?
I mean, it's an interesting question what might have happened if he hadn't, because so much happened right after he died. If he hadn't died of cancer, it would be really interesting to see how he would have weathered things like 2014 if, the U.S. government had done what it did then. But
can you still find Hello Presidente on YouTube?
I think so. I think it's like I haven't watched. I've seen like clips of it, but people show them to me. I haven't done that search myself. Now I'm going to. Yeah, no, I'm going to. And if not there, I could probably find bootleg DVDs.
If it's translated.
Oh man. Yeah. Yeah. No, I really do kind of want to watch that.
No more questions? Thank you.
Guys, I'm just going to do my spiel real quick. If anyone is interested in becoming a member of the Phi Alpha Theta History Honor Society, just let
I'm like
me
way
know.
too close to the webcam. Sorry, everybody.
It's a $50 lifetime membership, but it gives you access to an international history honors society that gives you a certain amount of credibility on your resume. You get to wear a cord at graduation, and you also get access to a year's subscription to History University. So if you're interested, you just need a 3.1 GPA, I think, in history.